future doesn't have to be like that. If you step on in to the secret kindergarten, showing you that your young children hold the key to understanding the universe, understanding the self, and therefore they hold the key to human freedom. Your child is the gatekeeper. Only you can open the gate, and the secret kindergarten is going to show you how.
Hello, welcome back to the secret kindergarten. This is the grown-ups edition of the secret kindergarten. I'm your host Gino, and today's episode, we are continuing our study of fairy tales. We are looking a little bit at the genealogy of fairy tales. I'm determined to prove that fairy tales are important, are the most important thing, and contain the most important teachings. So we're going to keep going with that. We'll look at some work and research that others have done in order to understand the where and the why. More the why of fairy tales. I just wanted to remind you that you can find the links to anything I'll read or refer to during the show in the description of this episode once it is published on my website. You can check out previous shows in the revolution.radio archives. You can download my content for grown-ups or content for kids on all podcast platforms on thesecretkindergarten.substack.com, on my YouTube, Rumble, BitChute, Odyssey, and on thesecretkindergarten.com. And if you want to support me, I provide services that you can find on my website, secretkindergarten.com. Thank you for tuning in to revolution.radio, the number one listener-supported radio station in the whole world. True story. So please help support our efforts and airtime by visiting the station's donations section on our website, revolution.radio. Alright. I found a book called Tales of Magic, Tales in Print, on the genealogy of fairy tales and the Brothers Grimm, by Willem de Blacourt. It's from 2012. Any book after 1990? Well, you got to be careful. That's what I think. I think this was printed by one of the universities too, so with a pinch of salt, let's get into having a look at this. I'm going to read some of the epilogue, just to ruin all these books that I show. Right. Narrators obtained their material from a variety of sources, oral and printed. As far as it concerned tales of magic, they ultimately drew on booklets, pamphlets, broadsheets, journals, and other reading matter. The inclusion of these originally literary stories signaled a breach with the past, especially with an older repertoire of legends about everyday life magical figures. Now, I just forgot to say that in these books on fairy tales, there is the dispute of how they made it through antiquity, where they came from. Some say that they were transmitted orally and then eventually documented by the Brothers Grimm, and I assume other people. Excuse me. This man, Willem de Blacourt, argues that they were not. They were from a variety, oral and printed, but the tales containing magic were literal, came from books and writings. Okay. In their oral manifestations, witches, werewolves, ghosts, and nightmares and other malicious beings did not mesh very well with their fairy tale counterparts. When, in the late 18th century, tales of magic began to be used for teaching, for injecting a sense of morality into children. They were part of the drive to reform notions that were depicted as superstitious by teachers, ministers, and journalists. The same group of people from which the folklorists were recruited. In that sense, both the tale that contained the warning about the magic book and the one in which it was freely consulted fell into the same educational slot. When the people who responded to queries about stories related tales of magic, rather than stories about witches and their kind, they conformed to standards that were more modern than their interpreters would have it. There is still a lot of work to do on both the changes in narrators, repertoires, and the collecting and interpretive activities of folklorists. But signs are that those folklorists who took the trouble submerging themselves in the field, instead of merely asking colleagues or pupils about stories, were less ready to promote mythological theories than those who stayed away from it. If the field workers unearthed anything, it was contemporary notions instead of remnants of a distant, preferably pre-Christian past. Folklorists in the field still exhibited a paternalistic attitude to their informants, but less so than their armchair colleagues. And in a number of cases, contact with possible sources of stories was frustrated from the start. During the 19th century, communal narration was in a state of transition. Some narrators may have stuck their trusted stock of tales. Others went with the times and started to include tales of magic, replacing the older legends. Literacy and orally transmitted magic were opposite forces, and the power that was traditionally ascribed to magic books reflected this. As literary products, the tales of magic never belonged to the orality side. They were part of the movement to combat it. When in the course of the 19th century more and more tales of magic were recorded from oral sources, a process that continued well into the 20th century. It showed the relative success of the campaign against orally transmitted concepts such as witches and revenants, tales of magic which presented magic as something out of a fantasy world, at least in the repertoires of a limited number of storytellers, gradually replaced the everyday life magical discourses and made them harmless. The witch in whom one does not believe any more becomes a fairy tale witch. Alright, so I gotta say, with this person's writing, I'm not 100% on where he stands, but what I'm taking from this is that some of the fairy tales are from an oral tradition, which I'm assuming they're suggesting are actually old, really old, and then some of them aren't, and the ones that aren't are stories that people of the time had an issue to because they were paganistic and they wanted to turn them into a more fantastical type of story. Okay, so maybe they did that. And the question is, how long, what am I trying to say? A fairy tale. How old does a fairy tale have to be, or how long does a fairy tale have to survive for it to be important and meaningful or worth reading to the kids? I don't think there's an answer. Of course, judging from this, we could take that as true and filter through fairy tales and find the ones that are more fantastical and assume that someone's played around with them. At the end of the day, I do think that you look at the story, I mean, it's still art, arguably more objective than other art forms, as sort of Rudolf Steiner inferred. But the point is, what is the tale trying to say? Could someone write a fairy tale today that contains spiritual laws and teachings inside the fairy tale allegorically? Yeah, I think so. So yeah, there's obviously an intellectual argument about, are these tales original? So it's more this is coming from a place of, I would say, preservation and a little bit critical. I think they're trying to be too polite. I think it's a little bit critical of Christianity in the 19th century. There's also spiritualism in the 19th century, and there were Christian people that were spiritualists too. So I don't know. Okay, so is it that important is the question. I don't know, but now I'm late trying to sound intelligent by having a monologue after reading. Right, let's go to my boy Varg Vikernes and Marie Cachet. Varg Vikernes, from the black metal band Burzum, who does a lot of interesting work on paganism. We've looked at his book before, Paganism Explained. This is part 1, Thrymskvida. I'm sorry. Let's read, as part of the introduction, Shadows Dancing on the Wall. I think that's the first chapter. Imagine that you are a child again and you still believe in Santa Claus. When your parents tell you about the Yule traditions, you see them from the perspective of a child. Innocent, but also ignorant. When you grow older, you understand that there is no Santa Claus, and you see reality. You have passed a test. You have turned around and can now see what is causing the shadows on the wall in front of you to dance. Our mythology must be understood in this light. The purpose is not to make people believe in fictional entities and fantastical events. The purpose is not to make people believe the shadows dancing on the wall are real. The purpose is to educate and to distinguish the wheat from the tares. This explains the purpose of our mythology, but it also explains why the tradition of our forebears was replaced by Christianity and some places Islam. The native European tradition was a system of tests, and only the best would pass those tests and become initiated. When the native European man diminished because of the domestication of animals, agriculture, and later civilization, fewer and fewer native Europeans were able to pass those tests. And to more and more of them, their tradition remained a belief in Santa Claus, quote unquote. Before we continue, let me explain briefly why and how the domestication of animals, agriculture, and later civilization diminished the native European man. In short, this brought an easier life and a much more comfortable life. The natural selection that the nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyle had ensured was removed. Life became too easy and too comfortable, and the native European man began to domesticate himself. This auto-domestication in turn led to a dramatical lowering of the intelligence level of the native European man. Because of that auto-domestication, gradually, over time, more and more native Europeans failed to turn around and see what caused the shadows to dance on the wall in front of them. Even in the classical antiquity, the native European tradition had lost almost all meaning to the vast majority of native Europeans. It offered close to nothing to them. The majority had become too simple-minded to discover its deeper meaning. Thus, when Christianity arrived, it was possible to replace the native European tradition. The average man still believed in Santa Claus, so to speak, and thus could be duped, bribed, threatened, or forced to accept a new faith. with promises that were much more attractive than that silly belief in Santa Claus. The new faith from the desert had little real content too. It had the depth of a shallow bathtub. So the native European man kept his native European traditions, even though he had officially accepted a new faith. Therefore we see today a Christianity so steeped in pagan traditions, celebrating pagan high festivals and pagan gods and goddesses as saints, like the well-known Santa Claus, and incorporating pagan myths, song, stories, and even ideals. Because of that, we are even today able to explain the native European tradition from A to Z. Alright, things are starting to tie together now, eh? So what's important is this, he didn't say the word Mayutics, but he talks of Mayutics, this, practicing symbology, looking at the deeper meanings of things. I think that's what is important. And he, Varg Vikernes admits here, or says here that that Christianity is steeped in the paganism. So while our author up the top here, Willem de Blakecourt, focuses on, the mechanics of that, people changing things, well, okay, things were changed, but what's important is the meaning behind behind the story, and understanding the message, because the message is most likely, or a lot of the fairy tales, or most of them, the ones that have stood these tests of time, contain teachings of spiritual laws, natural laws. And from there we move to Robert Bly. In his book, More Than True, The Wisdom of Fairy Tales. And let me just see. Yes, Robert Bly just wanted to find out if fairy tales had meaning to them. And he looked into it intuitively, according to his book. But I will read the introduction. Here we go. The wisdom of the ancients hints that the old people know more than we do. The amazing harmonies of wedding rings, imagined as gold crowns, the castles where the fat king lives, the agony of the daughter, who keeps near her father by asking riddles, the great hammock let down from the stars, lovers playing on its fringes. Such abundance is dazzling. The human soul arrives as a frog, having regressed since the Council of Nicaea. A boy needs the help of so many others to overcome his father's jealousy. He's subtly moved to a meadow bordering a lake, where a dragon eats sheep every night at dusk. There are stories with naked narratives that some speculate are remnants of vast festivals of narrative operas, retold in the simplest language 700 years later. In Norwegian fairy tales, the storyteller kept his audience in thrall with certain possibilities of fabulous healing, changing the king to the local rich farmer. The gold services to a silver spoon, the castles to a well-built Norwegian farmhouse with towers dazzling only by comparison with the surrounding fine woods. Other stories come down from the mystery initiations and teachings later destroyed by forces that preferred Christianity, and were unlike ancient mass festivals in that they contained secret symbols and paid attention to stages of human growth. Some stories contain information meant for men and women on private journeys, seeking their way, and there are accounts of practices in which the community would drum around the shaman as he or she ascended, calling out from each successive world. Sometimes fairy tales are stories of incidents, supernatural or otherwise, told and retold, in which the psyche is trying to communicate what it knows, trying to slip something past the guards of the dictator ego, embroidering it, adding elements, altering original effects, until it finally reveals some complicated truth that the fundamental imagination has wanted to see embodied for a long time. So, the psychological genius, who might have been an observant shaman or rebel priest or wise woman of the tribe, not only had to convey some important idea, for example, the stages in development of the psyche, but also had the problem of making the stages clear, while creating incidents so vivid, so astounding, so colourful, so amusing, so obscene, so satisfying to the rebellious mind, that these incidents would not be forgotten. They hoped that the story might be remembered for hundreds or thousands of years, and the details would still arrive fresh in the resonating soul, ready to take them in. Somehow the old king and the golden-hair princesses and the dangerous high-crested dragons with evil tempers have resonated for centuries in the unconscious mind. These princesses and dragons are folded buds that, after several thousand years of development in language, have begun to unfold in the conscious mind, and this book is an attempt to help with the later opening, so that the conscious mind may receive the fragrance of the old stories, tales told centuries ago by male and female geniuses. My wife, Ruth, and I have enjoyed reading and talking about fairy tale stories for years. They are gifts that help both of us understand the craziness of our lives. When I decided to do this book, I realized that my job would be to use my intuition and write about stages of men's growth as I see them in these tales. I have no authority for my interpretation of themes in such stories, but I admire some astonishing thinkers on those matters. James Hillman, Ernest Becker, Gurdjieff, Ortega y Gasset, Kierkegaard, Yeats, and of course, the two men who first turned over the closed box of male growth by standing on their heads and so putting their heads down near Hades. I mean those two old clowns, Freud and Jung. And now we also have the work of Martin Pretschel, Robert Moore, Robert Johnson, and Malidoma Some. I think I pronounced two of those names correctly. What has endured through human history are the stories. They are amazing trees of sound that grow inside the human memory and are fed by some longing for intimacy with others. The stories examined here are fed by the praise of the group after the last word of the story is spoken. These stories are full of information. They belong to us all. Well, super interesting. So there you go. It really is just down to the reader to understand, to decode, because at the end of the day, kudos goes to those who wrote them. We can argue about where exactly they came from and who did what to them, but the stories that stand the test of time, whether it be hundreds of years or thousands of years, are really good stories. And they're symbolic and they're allegorical. And if the 18th or 19th century, Christian spiritualists had something to say, well, is their message important or not? Is it, say if there's a story from then, is it an allegory about something that's important for us to understand? Stages of human development. Okay. And so, speaking of, doing the work and finding the meaning inside the fairy tales and taking things from that perspective of, taking the responsibility to support, promote fairy tales, to discover the deeper meanings and to understand them and share them with others, I came across this lovely website called fairytales.pushpack.de. So it's a German website, DE, and it's fairytales.pushpack, PUSHPAK, When I publish this, I will put the link. And I'm just going to read their introduction. It's fantastic. Here we go. Welcome to the mystical world of all old fairy tales. Sorry, not all old fairy tales. They seem remnants of ancient times, when there were no washing machines, cars, aeroplanes, and supermarkets. Those tales don't talk of computers or mobiles and still touch us deep inside. It is strange, but human problems seem to be the same: greed, hate, and illusion. And we still fight for or against nature according to personal interests, just as in those days. Fairy tales are the dinosaurs of our culture. Actually, they are extinct, but diligently collectors like the Brothers Grimm preserved the leftovers, at least to save the fossilized letters. But just as dinosaurs can come to life in the imagination of our children, so can also fairy tales. Maybe this is the only reason why they still exist. They have a message for us, otherwise they would have disappeared a long time ago. Nowadays, even psychologists are discovering fairy tales as an access to, or even a therapy for children and adults. That is really a wonder in our scientific times. Apparently, our rational minds urgently need to look from the narrow house that we have built over many years, at least through a small window, from time to time, in the vastness and depth of a fantastic, almost irrational world. And why not add a little inquiring magic to our defined scientific knowledge that we usually believe in? Not to create new definitions. Oh no, that's not the goal of this book. This is not about proving any beliefs as true or false. Here are some ideas to think about, to make the mind a little more flexible. To look at the usual things just from a different point of view, and maybe here and there to open a small window. Of course, in the end, it is also about truth, but in a much higher sense than on the conceptual level. For it is no longer a secret that the good old fairy tales have multiple levels. And as a person develops from a small child to an old man, these levels can open up one after the other. The great trick here is the contradictions in the stories, which become increasingly clear according to intellectual development. In the worst case, it says at the age of 20, such a nonsense, these fairy tales have nothing to do with this world. That could then be the end of the fairy tale. Or the magic awaits and the fairy tale gets really interesting. So, we're cracking into the point of fairy tales. The important thing is the maeutics, the decoding the symbols, the understanding the allegories. And yeah, I agree. If someone's written a fairy tale, in a way it doesn't matter where or when it's come from. Because writing a fairy tale means that you want to encode a message into a story, and that message is coming from obviously some higher order thinking. And if that message is universal, if that teaching is universal, then it's going to stand. It's going to last at least a couple of 100 years. Because it's going to speak to that truth. Okay, so we still have time, so we are going to look at... Oh no, I haven't even finished the introduction. Okay, cutting a long story short, we would like to give some suggestions for a deeper understanding of the old fairy tales. For this, we have come up with a few symbols that should accompany the reader on the journey, so that the petrified letters are not quite so lifeless in the long line, and the children's eyes have something to look at. The two triangles for female and male have a long tradition as symbols. In medieval alchemy, they also stood for the reddish fire and the bluish water, or for wind and earth. Their harmonious connection would be the hexagonal star, the two triangles overlapping each other. Accordingly, we generally use a hexagon here for nature. The circle and the sphere symbolize the sun, which gives light to the events, and the golden ball that rolls along the path of destiny. The eyes point to life, which is everywhere to be discovered, and the arms and legs to the living work. Some symbols have been borrowed from Indian culture, and we hope that others will be self-evident. Thus, on the following pages you'll find some fairy tale texts, such as those written by the Brothers Grimm some 200 years ago, together with our comments and interpretations in italics. With all good wishes, Undine and Jens. So there we go. Undine and Jens wrote a book, and they decoded some fairy tales, and they attached symbols and stuff to them. Fantastic. Absolutely amazing. Definitely check out their website. And let's look at their vision. After studying Christian, Buddhist, and Hindu scriptures, especially Hindu scriptures, for more than 20 years, and translating some Indian works into German on www.pushpak.de, we also met the old German fairy tales and Germanic legends on our way. On the one hand, in a quite practical manner, if such a small grandchild sits on your lap and wants to be entertained, and on the other hand also in a spiritual manner, because we find many symbols in the old fairy tales that touch us deeply and open some windows into a wonderful world. We think our old fairy tales do not need to hide their spiritual message from the spiritual works of other cultures. There is still a great potential in them that seems timeless and can still touch people from young to old. For this reason, we would like to try to write down some thoughts in order to inspire the parents and grandparents to once again resort to the old storybooks, so to speak, as an ecological alternative to the modern media. Good on you guys. That's definitely one of the biggest solutions to our situation today. And that's why I'm spending all this time looking at fairy tales and this stuff. Okay, in the last 17 and a half minutes of today's show, we will look at, I'll just read some of their work. So, The Wise Servant. The Tale of the Brothers Grimm, translated by M. Hunt in 1884, with an interpretation by Undine and Jens from www.fairytales.pushpak.de. Okay, The Wise Servant. How fortunate is the master, and how well all goes in his house, when he has a wise servant, who listens to his orders and does not obey them, but prefers following his own wisdom. A clever John of this kind was once sent out by his master to seek a lost cow. He stayed away a long time, and the master thought, "Faithful John does not spare any pains over his work." As, however, he did not come back at all, the master was afraid lest some misfortune had befallen him, and set out himself to look for him. He had to search a long time, but at last he perceived the boy who was running up and down a large field. "Now, dear John," said the master when he had got up to him, "hast thou found the cow which I sent thee to seek?" "No, master," he answered, "I have not found the cow, but then I have not looked for it." "Then what hast thou looked for, John?" "Something better, and that, luckily, I have found." "What is that, John?" "3 blackbirds," answered the boy. "And where are they?" asked the master. "I see one of them, I hear the other, and I am running after the third," answered the wise boy. "Take example by this. Do not trouble yourselves about your masters or their orders, but rather do what comes into your head and pleases you, and then you will act just as wisely as prudent John." Okay, so let's look at Undine and Jens's interpretation. The core of this fairy tale was already used by Martin Luther, who lived from 1483 to 1546, to interpret a Bible psalm and therefore seems to have originated far before that. We would like to use it to shed some light on a problem that was and is often discussed, especially with regard to the Bible, and not only in the context of the Protestant Reformation. The big question is, how far can we go in interpreting sacred texts like the Bible that are officially considered the words of the Lord, namely God? Great question. God, I'm lining this one up pretty good, aren't I, guys? How far can one differ from the official opinion? Some even say that you are not allowed to interpret anything and have to take every word literally. So, without thinking, however, how is that supposed to work? Every word that ears or eyes bring into us can only be interpreted in the way that we have learned in corresponding terms, how we were influenced to understand them for ourselves. We should be aware of this because in this respect we have a certain responsibility for what we think and do. Of course, we learn from our surroundings and inevitably orientate ourselves towards the opinion of others. Many expressions are already deeply imprinted in our memory in childhood. In addition, the social school system and the public media go to great lengths to ensure that people have relatively uniform terms and that we do not sink into the chaos of Babel, just as Goethe has Mephisto say in Faust. So, friend, my views to briefly sum: first, the Collegium Logicum. There will your mind be drilled and braced, as if in Spanish boots 'twere laced, and thus to graver paces brought, 'twill plod along the path of thought, instead of shooting here and there, a will-o'-the-wisp in murky air. Shout out to Willow of Willow's Poetry Corner. Stay tuned. After this show, we have an hour of fantastic poetry. I wonder if it'll be from the 19th century. Okay, moving along. This is certainly good and useful for a society, but it also has its downsides, because in old age, when wisdom wants to develop, it is often very difficult to make such frozen concepts flexible again. But it is precisely this mental mobility that should be our greatest wealth, which can distinguish us from animals and free us from the compulsive rule of nature. Because mental agility is the precondition for true freedom. Let's read that sentence there again. Because mental agility is the precondition for true freedom. And at the end of the day, reading stories to young children, full stop, promotes comprehension. And the more you read to a young child, the greater their comprehension is going to be. And that's proven. That's a fact. And what is comprehension? Comprehension is understanding. And understanding is required. If you understand things, you have mental agility. And here Undine and Jens are saying it's a precondition for true freedom. I agree. So there you go. That's foundational to this whole fairy tales are important ... We are spiritually bound without mental agility and can only think in narrow channels. In this regard, it makes little sense to seek truth in definitions or certain points of view, even if some people even claim they hold the authentic opinion of Jesus or Buddha. It is probably better to crack open these tough nuts and get to the core. This is the way to go if you want to know the message hidden behind the words. It certainly doesn't work without mental agility. And what I'm also getting from this is that it's kind of at the risk of offending people, it's good to have different cultural views and perspectives, because I think it's going to help to find the common thread or the core value, as they're saying here. The core. Crack open the tough nuts So these, we can look at these stories that are disputed on their etymology or their genealogy, and we could consider them tough nuts and try and get to the core of what was the person who wrote this or rearranged this story. What was their point? All right. An old saying goes like this: God gives us the nuts, but he doesn't crack them. Okay, so now they're breaking down lines. So from this story. So this line: how fortunate is the master when he has a wise servant who listens to his orders. Presumably, our fairy tale here refers primarily to the Bible, the Lord and his word, so to speak, and we should listen because we are his servants in the human body, which is like the temple of God. In practice, we are all sent as living beings into nature to look for something specific. That could be the cow, which is supposed to fulfill our worldly desires and promise certain wealth and happiness in life. This symbol, of course, comes from a long time ago. You can still find it in the Old Testament in the form of the golden cow or in the sacred cows of ancient Indian stories. When people still lived as farmers and ranchers before agriculture and cattle breeding, trees were worshipped that could give many fruit. Today it is mainly dead things like machines, which promise us wealth and happiness in life. But even earlier, it was known that this worldly happiness is difficult to hold on to. Another old saying: God gives the cow, but not the rope. Oh, that's my stomach grumbling. I'm getting hungry. If one regards the servant as a symbol for our self-consciousness, which is based on the worldly mind, then it may make sense to reach for worldly happiness. But if you see the higher reason of mankind in it, you could only see the cow as an incentive to set off in the first place and look for lasting and therefore better happiness. Okay, now another line from the story. Something better, and that luckily I have found. 3 blackbirds. So the servant found the 3 blackbirds. The 3 blackbirds remind us of the 3 ravens from the fairy tale of the faithful John, and could also symbolize messengers or paths that reveal what is in the dark for our worldly mind. Because birds can rise up from the earth into the air, symbolically from the material to the spiritual sphere. In another line, I see one of them. Regarding the blackbirds, I see one of them, I hear the other, and I am running after the third. The answer of the servant could thus relate to the 3 essential principles of knowledge, namely seeing in relation to the world of forms, hearing in relation to the world of concepts, and acting in relation to the world of deeds. There's that trivium there again. On the spiritual path, for example, one speaks of seeing a higher truth, hearing the divine word, and searching for knowledge and redemption. Similar principles can also be found in the Bible, only in a slightly different order. Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be opened to you. For whoever asks receives, and whoever searches will find, and whoever knocks will be opened. And now we've got time for... Okay, so I'm just going to scroll down. But rather do what comes into your head and pleases you. That's what the moral was, right? This development is a long way, and it is certainly not possible without your own diligence, delight, ideas, and intuition. This sharpens the famous sword of knowledge or wisdom in order to cut off the snares of our illusions and expose the view of truth. The crux of the matter here is, of course, our self-awareness. If it develops into a greedy ego that uses and interprets the Bible or similar works for selfish purposes, in order to attack others, to sow quarrels and discord, to establish dogmas, or gain personal advantage, the whole thing naturally misses the point and backfires. The selfless path is narrow, and you cannot take too much luggage with you. Here are the democratic principles that the external majority wins. Obviously fails because internal unity wins here. Hans Peter Dürr, a leading physicist at the Max Planck Institute, spoke briefly in an interview in 1997 on the subject of mental mobility. Nature plays like a child with a certain premonition. If you can't think of anything, you behave like matter and are a bore. Matter is curdled, solidified spirit that can no longer think of anything. And that is why we should not take the matter so seriously, but rather people who are always thinking of something new. So there you go. Especially for children, it's important to encourage independent thinking. Okay, so there you have it. So I recommend definitely, check out Undine and Jen's website. I hope I'm pronouncing their names correctly. www.fairytales.pushpark.de. And that concludes our next session of fairy tale exploration, the meaning of the genealogy, and da-da-da-da-da. Yeah, that's that. So, fairy tales, important because they are food for the soul. They are, I was going to say, like a tarot. And if we look at the tarot decks out there, if you go into a metaphysical shop, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different decks. There are loads of fairy tales out there. What's important is the decoding. Okay? So it's important to decode, to understand, and to pass those messages on through fairy tales to young children to create freedom. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you at the next one. Much love, everybody. Bye.